In late 1978 or early 1979, while working on the television series Delta House, National Lampoon writers Tod Carroll and John Hughes began work on a script. Plenty of films are written and never made, but this script, National Lampoon's Jaws 3 People Nothing, came remarkably close. It was written as a comedy about the filming of a Jaws sequel and satirized the shady behind-the-scene power struggles at the studio in charge. Jaws 3 People Nothing was the first of several lofty National Lampoon film projects to follow the massive success of Animal House. It's now remembered mostly as a footnote, the first screenplay of John Hughes' career, and an absurd National Lampoon sequel to one of cinema's biggest blockbusters that wasn't meant to be. In 1985, Hughes described his early days at the Lampoon and how that led to film work in an interview with the American Film Institute. Hughes had secured a development deal with ABC Television and Motion Pictures, and Jaws 3 was to be his first movie script under that arrangement.
It was really a good education, while it was, paving the way for the next thing, which was to write for the screen. And when Animal House came out, it was like, okay, well, the studios all rushed after Lampoon writers, and I got a development deal, which turned into a horrible script, which was followed by another pretty bad script, which was followed by another bad script. Actually, my first situation was, which was a parody of the Jaws movies, was a better situation from a learning standpoint because it was, it's one of those things where you just, when you start out, you just want to get something made. You just have to get something made. And there was a great deal of disappointment involved with that. And it really wasn't very good. I mean, it wasn't about, is this a good script? It was more, is this something that they'll make? Which is really the wrong question to ask. But, when I was working in that situation, it was the only question I could conceive of.
Welcome to Pretty In Podcast, Episode 3 of a series exploring the work and career of filmmaker John Hughes. In this episode, I'll explore the unmade screenplay for National Lampoon's Jaws 3 People Nothing, written by John Hughes and Tod Carroll, based on a story by Maddie Simmons. Hughes' involvement is somewhat minor. In the intervening years, the narrative of how Lampoon's Jaws 3 came to be and its demise has been driven by National Lampoon founder and Animal House producer Maddie Simmons. Simmons is quick to take credit and quick to lay blame, which can muddy the waters, so to speak. And, as best as I can tell, the story of Jaws 3 People Nothing is a story that has never been properly told. And to tell it properly, let's go back to June 18th, 1978. On that day, 2 movies were released. Grease, starring John Travolta, who was following up his Academy Award-winning performance in Saturday Night Fever, and Australian pop star Olivia Newton-John. It went on to be the top-grossing movie of 1978. Also released on that day was Jaws 2, which easily took the box office during its opening weekend. Though the sequel never came close to the $260 million the original Jaws film brought in, with almost $78 million at the box office, it was briefly, at least until The Empire Strikes Back was released, the highest-grossing sequel of all time. Another sequel to Jaws was inevitable, but producers David Brown and Richard D. Zanuck would have known to expect further diminishing returns and higher production costs on the next film. It was all but inevitable. When the original Jaws was made in 1975, its initial budget of $3.5 million had ballooned to roughly $9 million. When Jaws 2 was made, reportedly without an initial budget, it would eventually cost between $20 and $30 million to make the picture. So, although it made a healthy $78 million at the box office, its return on investment was not nearly as impressive. For every dollar spent on Jaws, the return was almost $28. For every dollar spent on Jaws 2, the return was only about $2. If Zanuck and Brown were going to make a third film, the budget needed to come down a lot. Besides, the studio wasn't sure that a horror film was going to get audiences into theaters. The country was slipping into recession. Ned Tannen, the president of Universal Studios' film division, believed that in the coming years, audiences would turn more and more to comedies. It doesn't take a Rhodes Scholar to see the terrible situation the country is getting into. Recession or depression, two awful words. Audiences will be looking for escapist entertainment. We've been stressing comedy the last few years, from Animal House to House Calls. We'll be making more of both kinds. I think 20 to 25%, maybe even a third of next year's movies will be comedies. Maybe a comedic version of the Jaws franchise wasn't entirely a bad idea. There had already been several knockoffs that had performed well. Orca, released in 1977, had made $14.7 million, and in 1978, the ultra-low-budget Piranha brought in $16 million. Now, as for how National Lampoon got involved, that story is a mixture of fact and speculation. The story of how Jaws 3 People Nothing came to be overlaps in parts with a self-aggrandizing and conflicting story that Lampoon founder Matty Simmons has told over the years. And its origins? Those are the murkiest of all. Perhaps the earliest and most famous Jaws parody was the Land Shark, created and voiced by Chevy Chase for Saturday Night Live. Chase debuted the character on November 8, 1975, in an episode hosted by Candice Bergen.
Yes?
Mrs. Arlsberg?
Who?
Mrs. Baldwin?
Who is it?
Flowers?
Flowers for whom?
Plumber, ma'am.
I don't need a plumber. You're that clever shark, aren't you?
Candygram.
Candygram my foot. You get out of here before I call the police. You're the shark and you know it.
Wait, I'm only a dolphin, ma'am.
A dolphin? Well, okay.
According to one early news story, it was Chevy Chase who, around March or April 1979, mentioned the idea of Jaws meets Animal House to a producer, most likely his close friend Doug Kenney, the other co-founder of the National Lampoon. That producer, probably Kenney, intrigued by the idea, said he'd discuss it with Simmons. Also taking credit for the idea was Jaws producer David Brown, thinking that another straight Jaws might be a little much. Brown claimed that it was he who first suggested an Animal House meets Jaws films to Simmons. One thing both stories agree upon is this. When Simmons first heard the idea, he hated it. Simmons was set on a sequel to Animal House and protective of the National Lampoon brand. Yet, Simmons seems to have come around to the idea and set up a pitch meeting at the Friars Club in New York City with Doug Brown. Maybe Doug Kenney was there too. Over dinner, Simmons pitched a story about a Spielberg-like director who was constantly attacked by a great white shark during the filming of a Jaws sequel, and that, as the movie progressed, more and more parts of his anatomy would be bitten off. Brown loved the idea, or at least said he did, and brought the idea to studio head Ned Tannen, who approved it. Simmons recalled the moment that Tannen called with the news.
The next morning, David called me. Tannen loved it, he said.
You pick the writers, and I'll have your lawyer call business affairs at Universal and make the deal. I was delighted and walked back into the editorial offices. John Hughes was sitting at a desk talking to Tod Carroll, another Lampoon editor. I beckoned them to come into my office. I handed them the story outline I had written. You're going to write the screenplay for this, I said. Universal is going to make it, and I'm producing it with Zanuck and Brown. John Hughes shook his head in disbelief. Tod Carroll was speechless. We had a movie. Hughes and Carroll got to work on the script sometime in April, and over the next 6 months, the studio invested roughly $2 million into the film's pre-production. To put that in perspective, the average film budget in 1978 was only $5 million, and they hadn't shot any film. But they did manage to gather a somewhat impressive cast. Bo Derek, who made her debut 2 years earlier in a different Jaws knockoff, Orca, the Killer Whale, was cast as actress Darlene DePerk. Derek's character was to spend most of the film in a bikini or less. Stephen Furst, who played Flounder in Animal House, was cast as Butch Peluso, a leading man who'd let himself go during filming. Mariette Hartley, who'd recently won an Emmy for her portrayal of Dr. Caroline Fields in the Incredible Hulk episode Married, was signed on to play Marilyn Sellers, a tough-as-nails production chief. Cast in the starring role was a then-unknown Rodger Bumpass as Sonny in what would have been his film debut. Bumpass was to play a hapless Idaho hick who somehow ends up as the writer and director of the Jaws 3 sequel within the film. When the film was cancelled, Bumpass turned to voiceover work. He's now best known as Squidward Tentacles on Nickelodeon's SpongeBob SquarePants. Richard Dreyfuss was also rumored to have signed on for a role, though I can't really tell what it was supposed to be. And the studio hired Roger Corman protege Joe Dante to direct. In 1978, Dante had directed Piranha, a Jaws parody knockoff that Spielberg himself called the best of the Jaws ripoffs. About a year ago, I managed to get a hold of the second revised final draft script, with revisions spanning a period from August 28th to September 17th, 1979, along with several other John Hughes scripts that will inform future episodes of the series. The script begins with the author of the Jaws novel, Peter Benchley, typing up a page of the script for Jaws 3. Taking a break, he goes out to his pool and is about to dive in when he is snatched off the diving board by a shark. In a later scene, a Spielberg-like director walks off the set after the head of Mecha Studios, a man named Rutledge Canterbury, informs him that Benchley died without finishing the script. True to Matty Simmons' original vision, the director is, of course, missing his left arm and right leg. At a studio party later that evening, that echoes the opening of the original Jaws, Canterbury is also eaten by a shark while cavorting in the water with the film's female star, Darlene DePerk. The shark suffers from licking bowl syndrome, a close homonym to leaky bowel syndrome, if you say it with a French accent, which does happen later in the script. And that causes the shark to go after everyone involved in the production of the film. For some reason not quite explained. After Canterbury's death, Bernie Maven, temporary studio head and horrible human being, tries to keep things under control. Here's an excerpt.
Now, the first order of business is Jaws 3. It's a mess, and I'm going to make sure it doesn't stay that way.
That was Canterbury's project. Maybe it would be best to close it down.
Close it down? For your information, Jaws and Jaws 2 made more money than the Buick division of General Motors, the Episcopalian Church, and the March of Dimes combined. I'm the guy who fought and struggled to make this picture way the hell before Canterbury even dreamed of stealing it from me and turning it into a disaster. Hell yes, people said. You can't do that. You can't make another shark movie. You want to know what I told them? I I said, this is Hollywood. We can do anything here, anything. We can make a sequel to a sequel to a sequel of a film based on a book from an idea inspired by a boil on the ass of a Hungarian freedom fighter.
After a reading of the will, it's discovered that Rutledge Canterbury has willed his controlling share of the studio to Irma Gurning, a woman who works a movie theater ticket booth in Demeter, Idaho, a town whose chief industry is spud lint, a potato-based pocket lint. Maven sends his production chief, the beautiful but far from loyal Marilyn Sellers, to Idaho to convince Irma to give control of the studio to Maven. Instead, Sellers convinces Irma to head the studio herself, and when Sellers returns to Hollywood with Irma and Canterbury's illegitimate son Sonny in tow, Maven is livid.
You did this all wrong, Sellers. I don't understand. I do all kinds of nice things for you. I respect you. I always put down the toilet seat in the Executive John. I don't call you a broad or a twat. And what do? You blow the whole thing. You fucked up.
No, I didn't fuck up, Bernie. I may have fucked you, but I didn't fuck up.
Right. You fucked me, and you just went and picked up Irma Gurning, and you said to her, Irma...
The job is yours. Take it. And watch Bernie, Maven. He'll steal the elastic out of your underwear.
You said that?
And more.
Why?
Because second of all, you're a jackal. And because first of all, she's entitled to the job. It's hers, legally and morally. And because it's about time a woman ran a major studio.
You want to know why a woman's never run a major studio? You want to know why?
I think I know.
Because women do things like this. They betray the people who helped. Women are like cats. They keep themselves clean, but you can't trust them.
For the rest of the film, Maven attempts to gain control of the company by sabotaging the filming of Jaws 3. The script is intercut with the ridiculous and often tasteless gags involving movie star cameos, Hare Krishnas, and the intellectually disabled. Part of Maven's plan to sabotage the film involves putting Irma's somewhat dim and B-movie obsessed son Sonny in charge of writing and directing the film, which he does with the assistance of a Latin American bell captain who once wrote monster movies like Chihuahuas from Hell. Marilyn Sellers, perhaps the only sensible character in the film, does what she can to keep Jaws 3 on track. At one point, Sellers enters Sonny's hotel room to check in on the script's rewrite. Jaws 3 was now about a fish from outer space who decides to chuck it all and become a chiropractor in a tiny coastal village. The kind of movie that would appeal to people who lock their car doors and leave their windows down, the light beer drinkers, the low-tar cigarette smokers, and people who use scented bathroom tissue.
I don't know, Sonny. It might just be crazy enough to work.
By the end of the film, though, it all works out. Sonny's film gets made, and he's coupled up with Darlene DePerk. And of course, Bernie Maven meets his end at the business end of a shark. Though the script hasn't aged well, parts of the script are quite funny, and from a production standpoint, it's quite clever. Hughes and Carroll keep all but the climax of the movie out of the ocean, and make use of outtakes of previous Jaws films and the Universal-owned monster movies to keep costs low. Yet, even with the financial concerns of production addressed, in October 1979, Universal finally pulled the plug. According to Simmons, Tannen called me and asked me if he could see me. When I walked into his office, I saw something I had never seen before in the business world, a tear rolling down the side of his face. I had a small hunch then that I had a large problem. He told me immediately that he had to pull the plug on the movie. Dazed, I asked why, and he wouldn't give me an answer. I was furious. I went back to my office, called my lawyers, and immediately ended the 3-year contract I had with Universal. When Zanuck and Brown were told about it, they broke their contract as well. Zanuck and Brown, however, had already announced their departure from Universal way back in May. When Jaws 3 was announced in April, they were already coming close to the end of their contract. They already had a new deal at 20th Century Fox. The part of the story where Zanuck and Brown break their contract because of Jaws 3 is pure fabrication. However, it is true that Simmons asked to be released from his contract, or was encouraged to, which wasn't due to end until March of 1980. Matty Simmons wasn't happy at Universal, and was happy to talk about it to the press when he left the studio.
I have to do movies the way I feel they should be made. It's very difficult for a humorist to do business with a studio sitting in judgment about what is not funny, especially when they're not humorists.
The reason that the studio gave to the press for Jaws' cancellation was much simpler. According to an article by Charles Schrager for the LA Times Washington Post News Service on October 27th, Richard Zanuck said that although the first draft showed promise, the final screenplay wasn't funny to him, nor was it funny to his partner David Brown or Universal president Ned Tannen. According to Tannen, the script didn't work. Simmons didn't buy it, and he went looking for a different explanation as to why the film was canceled, and it wasn't until years later that Simmons was given one that satisfied him, by a former president of Universal Studios and one-time assistant to Ned Tannen, Tom Mount. Simmons claims that Mount said that it was Steven Spielberg who put a stop to the film. Spielberg allegedly went to Sid Sheinberg, the president and COO of MCA Universal Studios at the time, and said that if the Lampoon made a movie that satirized Jaws and made fun of him, he'd leave the studio. Reportedly, when Sheinberg got wind of the project, he shouted at Tannen, "What the fuck are you doing? You're making fun of our most esteemed film." It's a story that's grown legs in recent years. At Dragon Con 2013, Rodger Bumpass was asked how he got started in Hollywood, and he echoed Simmons' account, adding his own commentary.
I had a little high voice when I was a kid, and when I went through the change, it dropped like the mumps, as they say. And so I went to study at Arkansas State University, broadcasting, but got more interested in acting. And so I finally left Arkansas and straight to New York City, and got involved with a National Lampoon project, which was the third Jaws film, which was called Jaws 3, People 0. It was about a movie company about to make a shark movie, but unfortunately, we were going to use Spielberg's shark. It didn't move in the show how it worked. Well, Spielberg, a little insecure at that particular point of his life, stepped in and said to the studio, it's going to ruin the fantasy of Jaws if you guys do this, so you either cancel this film or I'm walking, so what do you think the studio did? And according to the script, I had a love scene with Derek.
But Spielberg stepping in to stop the film seems highly unlikely. True, Spielberg isn't fond of sequels, and about the possibility of his involvement in the Jaws sequels, he once said,
"That film was physically a nightmare, and I didn't want to go back on the water again. If they weren't drafting me, and they certainly couldn't, then I wasn't going to return voluntarily. If they talk about a sequel, I hope they don't talk to me. I've had it."
Spielberg was also a fan of director Joe Dante, and felt that Dante's Piranha was a better film than Jaws 2. When Dante's Piranha was released in '78, and Universal considered filing an injunction, it was Spielberg that defended the film, saying,
"No, you guys don't get it. It's a spoof. It's okay."
He later invited Dante to direct a segment in Twilight Zone the movie, and Dante would work with Spielberg again on Gremlins, Gremlins 2 The New Batch, and Inner Space. Spielberg was also a fan of National Lampoon's Animal House, or at least the film's star actor, John Belushi. In late '79, Spielberg was working with Belushi on the comedy 1941, a film the studio wasn't happy with. In fact, they'd recently cut over a half hour from the film against Spielberg's wishes. It's unlikely that Spielberg was directly involved in Jaws 3's cancellation, but while researching this episode, I came across another possible and somewhat far-fetched reason that may have played a small part in the cancellation of the film: studio politics. Ned Tannen and Sid Sheinberg may have wanted to keep Spielberg happy, but Zanuck and Brown may have had slightly different motivations. And while there's nothing to connect the cancellation of Jaws 3 to Zanuck and Brown's move to Fox, I find the parallel of what was happening at Fox and the rise to power by a smart female executive in the Jaws 3 script too convenient to be coincidence. When Zanuck and Brown made the decision to move to 20th Century Fox in May of that year, it was with the understanding that they would be answering to Alan Ladd Jr., the president at Fox when Star Wars, Young Frankenstein, The Poseidon Adventure, and Alien were released. But in the months immediately following Zanuck and Brown's announcement, Ladd left the studio and Fox underwent several top-level executive changes, the creation of new departments, and minor scandals. By the end of the year, Fox's executive had almost entirely changed, and it would have been rumored that an ambitious 35-year-old former math teacher and actress, Sherry Lansing, was poised to take over as president of 20th Century Fox Productions. It was the new vice chairman and chief operating officer at Fox, Alan Hirschfield, a former president of Columbia Pictures, who brought on Lansing. Lansing was more than qualified. In 3 years, she had worked her way up from an executive story editor in 1975 to the industry's first female senior vice president of production in 1978. Of Lansing, Hirschfield said this to the New York Times.
"Why not a woman? I did a lot of looking, and Sherry's qualifications are as good as anyone's. She was Columbia's senior production executive on The China Syndrome and Kramer vs. Kramer, pictures that are enormous commercial and critical successes, and she's young. I want a younger group of people running production. It's critically important to have the head of production feel the pulse of the audience. The latest Motion Picture Association of America report shows that the audience is still trending down in age. 60% of the audience is between the ages of 14 and 24. Sherry can attract the younger creative movie makers who can make pictures that attract the younger audience."
During the turmoil at Fox, Zanuck and Brown had yet to get a project approved, and Jaws 3 People Nothing's plot, exposing the inner workings of a movie studio, starring an ambitious and backstabbing female movie executive, may have seemed a little bit too close for comfort, especially since, if Lansing did get the job, it would be up to her to greenlight Zanuck and Brown's films. Finally, there was increasing pressure from the studio to make family-friendly films, something the National Lampoon seemed incapable of. The Lampoon's humor was broad, crude, and edgy. A family-friendly film from National Lampoon would never have worked. Jaws 3, People Nothing, was dead in the water. Whatever the true reason for the cancellation of Jaws 3, People Nothing, producer David Brown, who had nothing to do with the poorly received Jaws 3D, released in 1983, mused about what might have been in a documentary on the making of Jaws 2.
The attitude at Universal was, "You're fouling your nest. You can't do this." We should have fouled the nest. It would have been golden, maybe even platinum.
Next time on Pretty in Podcast, I'll step away from John Hughes and talk about a rumored Lost Count Basie album from 1968. Pretty in Podcast was written, produced, and performed by 517, which is me. This episode had some special guests, which were Sarah Innis of Dress Code Cracker Podcast as Lurkey, and Gillian Young as Marilyn Sellers. Theme music by Brad Davis of Fresh Snow, and incidental music for this episode is from John Lindemann, courtesy of Team Beat Records. You can look up Pretty in Podcast on Facebook and Twitter, and show notes at prettyinpodcast.com. And if you like the show, tell your friends, subscribe and rate on iTunes or wherever else you get your podcasts from. Two sources served as the primary starting points for this episode. Maddie Simmons' isolated account of National Lampoon's involvement in Jaws 3 People Nothing was taken from Fat, Drunk, and Stupid, the inside story behind the making of Animal House. And I also turned to Kirk Honeycutt's excellent and essential John Hughes, A Life in Film. And one more thing. About Sherry Lansing. She was awesome. After serving as the president of 20th Century Fox in 1980, Lansing moved on to Paramount Pictures in 1992, where, as CEO, Lansing produced 6 of the 10 highest-grossing films for the studio, including 3 Best Picture Academy Award winners. 80% of the films released under Lansing's tenure were box office hits.
You were at Columbia Pictures, very successful there. moved to 20th Century Fox. You are the president of a major studio, and followed up Star Wars, which is absolutely amazing. It was the picture of all time so far, right?
Yes.
And you have had hit after hit after hit. How did you get to where you are, in your own 25 words or less?
Well, in 2 words, I would say hard work. And again, going back to what I said previously, I think that one achieves things by enjoying what you're doing at the time, enjoying the process, and not worrying about the next step. I was always happy when I was a story editor, when I was an executive story editor, whatever, doing that job. And I never worried about the next job. So I guess if I was to offer any advice, I would say to work hard and to enjoy the process of what you're doing.
If you were married right now and your husband were a professional career person, would he have equal rights in the family with you? I mean, would you be able to compromise and share and operate in a non-corporate sense?
Yes, I certainly hope that